What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. The Pittsburgh Steelers have officially released their initial 53-man roster. Tough day around the league for sure. Some really difficult decisions I feel like to be made here. Wanted to jump on here and just talk through some of those things. Who stays, who goes, how these positional battles ended up playing out, the end of the roster kind of shakeup, and then just kind of where the team could look to add a player or two just over the next 48 hours or so. So before we do that, if you guys could, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, drop me a comment. All that stuff is greatly appreciated on my end. I would really appreciate it. Without further ado, let's jump into this thing. Just a couple quick notes to keep in mind here. So this is the initial 53-man roster. So the bottom of the roster is always extremely fluid. There are guys that are on this list that we'll talk about today, position by position, that may not still be on the roster by the time you watch the video. Okay, so you just got to keep that in mind. And the reason for that is because NFL teams kind of have to go through some roster gymnastics in terms of how they sneak guys onto the 53, the IR, like there's in terms of how much length of service you have, that determines whether you are waived with this having to go through waivers. If you have 4 or more accrued years, you are not subject to waivers. So we'll talk about like one player in particular. I think that's kind of pertinent information to talk about. But going to share my screen here, and then we'll just kind of go through these things kind of one by one. Hopefully that's big enough font. This is just from Steelers.com, the initial 53-man roster. So first thing that you'll notice, we got a balanced lineup, 25-25, and then 3 specialists to make up the 53. Really interesting decision. They end up keeping all 4 quarterbacks. I think a couple things could be of note here. One, they still may be looking at a potential trade of a guy like Skylar Thompson. Maybe they're still working some things out on that regard. There's also been some reports out there that the Steelers are actually going to place Will Howard on the injured reserve. In order to do that, I guess they kind of wanted to make sure that they kept him on the initial 53 so that they could bring him back, kind of gauge where the health of the roster is throughout the season to see if they needed to call him back up. It is kind of worth noting that, like, if you're on IR, obviously you can't practice. Young guys like that, they kind of need the very limited reps that they're actually allocated in practice. So that is something to keep in mind there. But in terms of Skylar Thompson, definitely kudos to him because he clearly did enough over the final couple preseason games to warrant a roster spot in this regard. So we'll see what happens with Howard, whether he goes on IR and then returns later in the year, how that all shakes out. No surprises at running back. I think these 3 guys are really the 3 guys that we've kind of pigeonholed into this kind of timeshare. You're going to have Jalen is going to be the lead back with Caleb kind of working in, especially on early downs early, and then Gainwell is kind of going to be their change of pace receiving threat out of the backfield. Now, looking at the offensive line, Andres Pete was a guy that I ended up putting on my 53-man roster. I didn't actually put out a final. It was kind of on me. But the 2.0 version that I did, I actually had him making it. He played left tackle early in the preseason, kind of struggled a little bit. And then he played left guard, looked a little bit better, I felt like, on the interior. I just think that that's probably the better home for him. But he ends up making the roster, at least right now. The other thing to note is Calvin Anderson, who the team re-signed to be their swing tackle. He missed a lot of time this summer, but he is actually back practicing, which is a good sign. So I could still see them maybe looking at an ad along the offensive line. I still feel like the depth is pretty shaky, but I'm sure most of the teams around the league feel the exact same way. So we'll see. There are some interesting names that have been thrown out there in terms of guys being put on waivers, some undrafted free agents that I felt like played pretty solid in the preseason that were let go to maybe take a look at. Tight end position, I know everybody's going to probably moan and groan about Connor Hayward continuing to be on the roster, but that just is what it is. He's a special teams contributor. Everybody knew that he was going to make it. This is an offense that's going to be really heavy, 12, 13 personnel oriented. He was always going to make the roster. So I'm not really surprised by that whatsoever. The wide receiver spot, again, I think that this has been set in stone for a couple of weeks now. I talked about it when I went to Latrobe for training camp about how impressed I was with Scotty Miller. I felt like he was the second best wide receiver they had there. Roman Wilson played better in the preseason, which is definitely some signs of optimism in that regard. Calvin Austin's back practicing. Not really sure what the status is of Ben Skoranek. He's dealing with a toe injury, so that's something to definitely keep an eye on. Is he going to be healthy enough to ready to go week 1? You definitely don't want to head into week 1 with only 4 active wide receivers healthy, so that's something to keep an eye on. I think the obvious point of contention here is that the Steelers still need to add a wide receiver in some form or fashion via trade or signing, in my opinion. We're just getting really late into the process to where it's difficult to see them being able to acquire like a legitimate player that's going to be kind of a needle mover. The one guy out there that I would continue to point out is Jacoby Myers for the Raiders. Vegas just ended up signing Amari Cooper, another guy that could maybe take some flanker reps. Not really super impressed with his film in particular, but I do love Jakobi Meyers. I did a film room for my channel members last season around the trade deadline. He was someone that I really wanted them to go after instead of going after Mike Williams. But now he's requested a trade out of Vegas. Myers is a bigger receiver, very reliable. He can win versus man coverage. He's very, very sure-handed. Doesn't have like elite speed or athleticism, but the Steelers have a ton of team speed. You look at the wide receiver room right now, they've got a ton of that. They need somebody that can get open and separate versus man. He's a good route runner. I'm a big fan of Myers' game. I think he's one of the more underrated wideouts in the league. Legitimate wide receiver too, so I'd have no qualms with giving up, even if it's a 2026 mid-round pick, to go get him and then sign him to a subsequent contract extension. So, but those are the areas that I would kind of keep an eye on. We'll see what happens with Will Howard. Does he actually go to IR? That'll open up a roster spot for them to add to the 53. We'll see what the move with that is, and then I would just keep an eye on maybe an offensive line addition. They are getting healthier up front, so maybe that calms that need a little bit, but definitely wide receiver. That's something that I feel like every Steeler fan is going to be monitoring just over the next couple of days. Is there a guy via trade that they could pick up? Is there a waiver claim that they can go in and put out there? So we'll see how it plays out. Kind of moving on to the defensive side of the ball a little bit. We'll start with the defensive line before we move on to anything else. And I think there aren't really any, I guess, surprises here other than the number that they kept. I had them keeping 7 guys. I believe in my 1.0 prediction. I think I moved it down to either keeping it at 7. 8 is a little bit rich for me, so that's something to keep an eye on. I think the necessary point to note out here is that Derek Harmon's banged up, even though it seems like he's going to avoid injury reserve, which is a very good thing. He could be unavailable for week 1, so that could have caused him to keep an additional person over that. The beneficiaries are Sezi and Logan Lee. Those guys played a decent amount in the preseason, so not super surprising in that regard either. Obviously, Y.A. Black had a fantastic preseason, just did a full film room on my channel about his performance against the Panthers in week 3, but he was really fantastic really throughout preseason. So if you haven't checked out that video, very impressed with what he's been able to bring to the table. Honestly, didn't have it on my bingo card that he was going to be the most impressive rookie throughout the preseason, but it was really good to be surprised. I'm excited about his growth and development. And then Quale, the team's free agent signing, he's going to be the backup nose tackle. I feel like to Keanu Benton. I feel like that's pretty much set in stone. And then they're going to get Cam Hayward back into the fold once we get into real game action. Kind of talking through the linebacker spot, it seems like Mark Robb ends up being the odd man out here. Now, could he be a guy that reverts back to the practice squad? I could definitely see that taking place there. But Cole Holcomb getting back to full speed and working himself back into game action after really going through that really traumatic injury that he suffered. It's just a really feel-good story. I'm happy for Cole. It's an awesome thing for the Steelers to have that amount of linebacker depth, to have guys that have been 3-down players in the past like Holcomb, but also, just the depth that they've been able to accrue with Malik Harrison taking over Landon Roberts' old role of being the thumper on rundowns, but also Harrison's ability to contribute on special teams, I feel like was kind of the differentiator between him and a guy like Roberts, even though I think Roberts is probably the better player on the defensive side of the ball, just a little bit older. Jack Sawyer ends up being the 4th edge. The team ends up releasing DeMarvin Leal. Not super surprised by that. Some people maybe were, but former 3rd-round pick just never really found a positional home in a Steelers uniform. Could he be a guy that they bring back for the practice squad? In terms of, depth, anything like that. We'll see. I also think that Leota is another guy that they maybe bring back on the practice squad. I felt like he was pretty solid through the preseason in terms of maybe a 5th edge rusher that you could call up if in the event that Nick Herbig isn't going to be ready for week 1, which sounds like that actually could be a reality. Alex Highsmith's back. He's working his way back to being a full participant at practice. Nick Herbig didn't practice yesterday. It sounds like he's a little bit more on shaky ground in terms of week 1. Both of those guys dealing with soft tissue injuries, so you never really know with that. But Carson Bruner ends up being the 5th inside linebacker that they keep. That's really all special teams value right there. Bruner was a 4-phase special teamer at Washington. He's a guy who was top 3 in special teams among all players, or at least rookies, and tackles on special teams in the preseason, and then snaps on special teams. It's very clear what their kind of vision for him was. And, all 7 guys from their rookie class end up making the roster initially, at least. So that's pretty interesting. Definitely, I think that's several years in a row that's actually taken place. You don't see that around the league very often. They end up keeping 8 defensive backs. Now, the distribution of labor here is pretty interesting because they really only have 3 true safeties. Of course, Jalen Ramsey got, I think, a snap at free safety in the preseason. I anticipate him playing some free safety, maybe in base personnel, depending on, the health and, performance of the guys around him. But, with Chuck Clark, who is running as the team's top backup at free safety and strong safety being let go, that's definitely something to keep an eye on over these next couple of days. Now, I mentioned this, but Clark is a guy that I think some roster gymnastics may be taking place here because he is a vested veteran. He doesn't have to go through waivers, meaning he is free to sign with any team, including the Steelers. Like, he's not subject to the waiver process. So they could have done a wink, wink kind of deal with Clark, like, hey, we're going to bring you back. We've just got to set our 53, get some guys to our, and then, play that back like that. Now, could they upgrade at safety? For sure. I think Clark is still a pretty solid player in the box. I think in terms of fitting the run and working downhill, he could definitely still do that. I think the further away from the line of scrimmage he gets, the more kind of scary it gets in coverage. But again, this is a guy that was available late August or late July, early August for a reason. But he does have a lot of experience, especially playing with some of the guys on defense. Deshaun Elliott, Patrick Queen. I think he's a pretty good communicator, really nice locker room guy from what I understand as well. So I expect Clark to be back, but although I wouldn't necessarily think twice about it if they ended up bringing in a better safety with a little bit more versatility, maybe a little bit more athleticism on the back end. But the other kind of I think the biggest surprise to me in terms of guys that made the 53-man roster. So Corey Trice got placed on IR to return. So you could designate a couple people that don't have to be on the initial 53, but still can return during the season. I think there's 2 spots that you could do that with. Now, one of the things that I would keep in mind here is Dante Kent didn't practice really all of summer. He was in a walking boot for much of that. He is back at practice now, but that doesn't actually mean that they can't place him on injured reserve now and then bring him back later in the season. We'll see what happens with that. I kind of think that that's probably the most likely outcome because James Pierre is not on this roster right now. Pierre is a guy who's been a gunner for them, a quality special teamer, actually had a pretty solid training camp, was fine in the preseason. You know what you're going to get with Pierre. He's a guy who's hung around the league for forever in this exact type of role. I don't necessarily think it's set in stone that he'll be back, but that's just the reality of kind of some of the decisions that they're going to be working through in terms of, filling out some of these special teams roles once we get to game day. But Kent's a guy, and then Howard is the other guy that I would anticipate, just keeping an eye on to see if they land on IR and then bring in 2 additional guys. Pierre and Clark would be the 2 guys that I would kind of keep an eye on in that regard. Beanie Bishop is going to be another guy that's going to be subject to waivers just because he's on his rookie deal. Bishop ended up having a pretty opportunistic rookie season. I thought that he was someone that would be worth developing. But as the summer kept getting going on and on, with the addition of Jalen Ramsey, that kind of took away his slot cornerback role. And then when we got into the preseason, he had kind of a rough first outing. They started experimenting with Brandon Echols, who was excelling on the outside, wanted to play him a little bit more on the inside. He just kind of fell out of favor. And if the team doesn't feel like you're going to be a true asset on special teams, maybe that's the ultimate kind of decision there. So we'll see what happens. I think Beanie, just based on box score production and the amount of snaps he played last year, I mean, he was a starter for at least the first 10 games or so. And then for whatever reason, they just started to play Cam Sutton over it, which was kind of a whole separate ordeal. But I anticipate that he might have some interest, but I hesitate to say that he's definitely going to be a guy that gets claimed or anything like that. The thing to keep in mind too is that less than 3% of players that actually get released end up getting claimed by another team. I think that a lot of times, and I used to be the same way when one of my favorite players at the end of the roster ended up getting released, I would always think worry about trying to get them back on the 53 or trying to get them back on the practice squad and things like that. It's worth worrying about for sure, but the statistical odds tell you that it's not nearly as frequent as you kind of think it is. So we'll see what happens with that. Again, I think that looking out for cornerback depth could also be a very real thing here. If they don't want to bring back a known commodity like James Pierre, one of the names I kind of already saw floated out there was a guy like Juju Brents from the Colts. He was waived. he's a guy who's had a lot of trouble staying healthy, but you just look at some of the measurables. The Steelers liked him a decent amount, I feel like, coming out of Kansas State, but again, has not played a lot. But you look at 96th percentile in height, 99th percentile in wingspan. If you look up like his comparisons and Spiderweb chart on Mock Draftable, the top comparisons for him are Justin Lane, who used to play for the Steelers, Ron Watts, drafted by the Steelers last year, Joey Porter Jr., drafted by the Steelers and still part of their starting lineup. So the tall, lanky, long press corners, like that's kind of what Brent, that's the archetype of player that Brent's falls into. So it wouldn't surprise me to see them take a look or a peek at him either. So hopefully you guys like the video. Oh, one more thing. Shout out to Corliss Waitman. He ends up winning the punter competition. I thought that it was really close to call. Waitman had a little bit better hang time through the preseason. It seems like that was probably the determining factor. Don't necessarily think it was financially a factor there. I mean, the Steelers ended up gaining like $1 million cap space, I think, over the next 2 years after, Waitman's forced into the equation. So I don't really necessarily think that that was part of it. It sounds like Adam Schefter was reporting that they actually had some trade interest around the league in him, because I think other teams expected them to keep Cameron Johnston. But shout out to Waitman. I think he earned the job. I thought he was okay last year, but he's just been better through summer and then through the preseason. So I definitely think that you can't take that away from him. We'll see what happens with that. Obviously, Chris Boswell is going to continue to be the kicker, but that's pretty much all I got on the 53-man roster. I am doing a Steelers Q&A kind of like mailbag for the site. I would also like to do a live stream before week 1 happens as well. So let me know if you guys are interested in that. And also, like, if you have questions for my mailbag that'll go up on Steelers Now, or just anything you want me to answer on the YouTube channel, I can do both if you prefer. But let me know if you have any questions, not just about like 53-man roster stuff, but other players around the league to look at. Throw me some names. If you guys have some players that you would be interested in Pittsburgh trying to go snag via waivers or maybe trade candidates or anything like that, be sure to throw me those names, because I would definitely be interested in, looking at other possibilities for sure. But just on your way out, don't forget, if you're looking for more content from me, especially like film room content, stuff like that, don't forget to grab a channel membership. It's the price of a small coffee, about $4 a month. You guys can, there's no long-term commitment, anything like that, but I'm going to be producing some more film room content. Going to have another film room up at some point this week, probably for those guys. So again, it's up to you guys. But other than that, have a good rest of your week. I'm sure I will talk to you guys here in the next couple of days.